The conference room at Harrison and Associates fell silent except for the steady tick of an antique clock on the mantel. My brother Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, practically glowing as the attorney read off his inheritance. The house, the truck, $45,000 in savings. When it came to my turn, the man cleared his throat and announced I would receive $1 silver and my grandfather's old journal. The room erupted. Marcus snorted so loud it echoed off the oak paneling. My cousin Jessica actually started giggling. My mother just shook her head with that look that said, "Well, what did you expect?" But 3 days later, when my phone rang and James Harrison asked me to come back to his office alone for a private matter, my grandfather had specifically requested. I had no idea that $1 silver was about to unlock the biggest secret our family had ever kept, a secret worth exactly $100 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 3 weeks ago I was just another elementary school teacher in Cedar Falls, Iowa, struggling to make ends meet on a salary that barely covered my rent, student loans, and the occasional splurge at Target that I'd regret for weeks afterward. Cedar Falls isn't the kind of place where dreams come true or fortunes are made. It's the kind of place where you're born, you grow up, you get a decent job, and if you're lucky, you retire with enough saved to take a few trips to see your grandchildren. I lived in half of a duplex on Elm Street, the kind of rental where the landlord promises to fix things, but never quite gets around to it. The kitchen faucet dripped constantly, creating a rhythm I'd grown so accustomed to that I couldn't sleep when I stayed anywhere else. My furniture was a mix of hand-me-downs from my parents and clearance finds from the furniture outlet on the edge of town. Nothing matched, but everything was clean and organized because that's how I'd learned to live, making the best of what you have. Every morning at 6:30, I'd wake up to my phone alarm playing the same gentle chime I'd been using for 3 years, because changing it felt like too much effort for something so small. I'd make coffee in the same blue mug my grandfather had given me for Christmas 5 years earlier, the one with a chip on the handle that I refused to throw away. Then I'd drive my 2014 Honda Civic the 12 minutes to Lincoln Elementary, where I taught 26 third graders who reminded me daily why I'd chosen this profession despite the pay. My students were everything to me. There was Emma, who struggled with reading but lit up when we talked about dinosaurs. There was Tyler, whose parents worked double shifts and who always lingered after school because he didn't want to go to an empty house. There was Maria, who spoke Spanish at home and English at school, and was teaching me that bilingual minds see the world differently. These kids deserved everything: new books, updated computers, art supplies that weren't dried out, field trips to places that would expand their understanding of what was possible. But Lincoln Elementary operated on a shoestring budget, like most schools in Iowa. I spent my own money on classroom supplies more often than I cared to admit. During back-to-school season, I'd hit every dollar store clearance sale, buying pencils and notebooks and glue sticks, because I couldn't bear to see my students go without. My checking account lived in a constant state of near overdraft, balanced precariously between paydays like a tightrope walker who'd forgotten to look down. The Mitchell family dynamics had been set in stone since we were children. Marcus was the golden boy, 2 years older than me, born with the kind of confidence that made people assume he was destined for success. He'd played football in high school, dated the homecoming queen, and somehow convinced everyone that charm was the same thing as competence. After graduation, he'd gotten his real estate license and started selling houses with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that worked well in a market where people wanted to believe their dreams were just one signature away. Marcus drove a white BMW with custom rims, and always wore suits that looked expensive, though I suspected he financed most of his lifestyle with credit cards and commission advances. He lived in a sprawling house in the newer subdivision on the north side of town, complete with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island bigger than my entire living room. When family gathered, Marcus would regale everyone with stories of his latest deals, dropping numbers and client names like confetti, making sure everyone understood that he was the success story our parents had always hoped for. My mother, Linda Mitchell, worked part-time at the local insurance agency and spent the rest of her time worrying about things she couldn't control, the weather, the economy, whether Marcus was eating enough vegetables, and why I couldn't find a nice man to settle down with. She had a way of asking about my life that made it clear she was really asking whether I'd figured out how to be more like Marcus yet. Her love came with conditions and comparisons, always served with a side of gentle disappointment that I hadn't chosen a more lucrative career path. My father, David, was a man of few words, who'd worked at the John Deere plant for 34 years and had opinions about everything but shared them with no one except my mother, and only then in whispered conversations I'd overhear when I visited for Sunday dinner. He was the kind of man who showed affection through practical gestures, checking my tire pressure when I wasn't looking, slipping $20 bills into my purse when he thought I needed gas money, always asking if my car was making any strange noises because he worried about me driving alone at night. Then there was Grandpa Bob, my father's father, who'd been the quiet constant in our family until Alzheimer's started stealing pieces of him 2 years ago. Robert Mitchell was 82 years old, a retired factory worker who'd spent 40 years building farm equipment, and somehow managed to raise 4 children on a blue-collar salary back when that was still possible. He lived alone in the same 2-story house on Maple Avenue where he'd raised his family, stubbornly independent, even as his memory began to fade like old photographs left in sunlight. Grandpa Bob was the kind of man who wore the same style of work boots for decades, who could fix anything with duct tape and determination, who read the newspaper cover to cover every morning, and remembered every Cubs score from the past 50 years, even when he couldn't remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. He shopped with coupons, drove a pickup truck that was older than I was, and had never owned anything that could be described as fancy or unnecessary. But what set Grandpa Bob apart in our family wasn't his frugality or his work ethic, though he had both in abundance. It was the way he paid attention to people. While Marcus would dominate family gatherings with his stories and achievements, Grandpa Bob would sit quietly and watch. He'd notice when someone seemed tired or worried. He'd remember details about your life that you'd mentioned months earlier in passing. He was the kind of person who made you feel seen without ever making a big show of it. Every Sunday after church, I'd drive over to his house to help with groceries and household tasks he was finding increasingly difficult to manage alone. We'd developed a routine. I'd bring lunch from the deli downtown. We'd eat together while watching whatever baseball game was on television, and then I'd help him organize his medications for the week or tackle whatever project he'd been putting off. Sometimes we'd sit on his front porch, and he'd tell me stories about my grandmother, who'd passed away when I was 12, or about his early years working at the plant when Cedar Falls was a different kind of town. During these visits, Marcus would occasionally stop by, usually when he needed something. He'd breeze in with his salesman's smile, ask Grandpa Bob how he was feeling, and then casually mention that business had been slow and his car payment was coming up, or that he'd seen this great investment opportunity but was just a little short on capital. Grandpa Bob would listen with the same patient expression he wore when my students told him elaborate stories about their pet hamsters, and then he'd write Marcus a check without asking many questions. I watched this pattern repeat itself for years, feeling a growing knot of frustration in my stomach every time Marcus treated our grandfather like a personal ATM. But I never said anything because that wasn't my place, and because Marcus always promised to pay the money back, even though we all knew he never would. Grandpa Bob never seemed bothered by it, or at least he never complained to me about it, but I noticed that he started keeping his checkbook in a drawer instead of on the kitchen counter where it used to sit. As his Alzheimer's progressed, Grandpa Bob's personality remained largely intact, but his short-term memory became unreliable in ways that were both heartbreaking and occasionally dangerous. He'd forget to turn off the stove, or he'd get confused about whether he'd taken his medication. Sometimes he'd call me in the middle of the night because he couldn't remember how to work the television remote, and wanted to check the weather forecast. These moments made it clear that he couldn't live alone much longer, but every time my parents brought up the possibility of assisted living, he'd get a stubborn look in his eyes and change the subject. The last coherent conversation I had with Grandpa Bob was about 3 months before he passed away. I'd stopped by on a Tuesday evening because he'd called and said his kitchen sink was making a strange noise. When I got there, the sink was fine, but he seemed agitated about something he couldn't quite articulate. We sat at his kitchen table drinking instant coffee that was too strong, and he kept looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Finally, he reached across the table and took my hand in both of his. His hands were rough from decades of manual labor with calluses that had never softened despite his retirement. He looked directly into my eyes with a clarity that had become rare in recent months and said, "Sarah, honey, I want you to know that I see how hard you work and how much you care about people. That matters more than most folks realize." I squeezed his hands and told him I loved him, assuming this was just another moment of confusion or sentiment brought on by his condition. But looking back, I realized there was something deliberate about that conversation, something that felt like he was trying to tell me something important without actually saying it. At the time, I thought he was just being sweet, the way grandfathers are when they're reflecting on their lives and the people they love. 2 weeks later, Grandpa Bob fell in his bathroom during the night. My father found him the next morning when he stopped by to check on him before work. The fall itself wasn't serious, but it revealed that his confusion had progressed to the point where he could no longer safely live alone. My parents made the difficult decision to move him to Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility on the outskirts of town that had a good reputation and a waiting list longer than a John Deere assembly line. The transition was harder on all of us than we'd expect. Grandpa Bob seemed to shrink in the unfamiliar environment, even though the staff was kind and the facility was clean and well managed. He'd always been a man who defined himself through his independence and his ability to take care of himself and others. Being cared for instead of caring for others left him looking lost in a way that had nothing to do with his medical condition. I visited him 3 times a week, bringing him his favorite butter cookies from the bakery downtown and sitting with him while he worked on jigsaw puzzles or watched old westerns on the television in the common room. Sometimes he knew who I was right away, other times it took him a few minutes to place me, but he always smiled when he figured it out, and he'd pat the chair next to him like he was inviting me to stay forever. Marcus visited less frequently, usually when my mother called and reminded him that it would mean a lot to Grandpa Bob to see him. During these visits, Marcus would sit stiffly in the visitor's chair, making awkward small talk about the weather and local sports teams while checking his phone for messages from potential clients. He seemed uncomfortable with the reality of aging and illness, as if spending too much time around these reminders might somehow be contagious. On a cold February morning, I got the call I'd been dreading but expecting for months. Grandpa Bob had passed away peacefully in his sleep, which the nurse assured me was exactly how anyone would want to go. I sat in my classroom during my lunch break, staring at my phone and trying to process the fact that the man who'd been a constant in my life for 28 years was gone. My students noticed I was quieter than usual that afternoon, and Emma brought me a drawing of a rainbow with Miss Mitchell written in careful 3rd grade handwriting across. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bottom. The funeral was exactly what Grandpa Bob would have wanted: simple, dignified, and mercifully brief. The Methodist Church was full of people who remembered him as a reliable neighbor, a steady coworker, and a man who'd raised his children right and treated everyone with respect. Marcus gave a eulogy that focused mostly on Grandpa Bob's work ethic and dedication to family, touching briefly on his generosity without mentioning the specific ways that generosity had benefited Marcus over the years. After the burial at Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery, we gathered at my parents' house for lunch and quiet conversation. People shared memories about Grandpa Bob's sense of humor, his loyalty to the Cubs despite decades of disappointment, and his ability to fix anything that broke. Someone mentioned that he'd been known to slip grocery money to neighbors who were struggling, always finding ways to help people without making them feel diminished by the gesture. As the afternoon wore on and the visitors gradually left, I found myself thinking about all the conversations I'd never get to have with Grandpa Bob, all the stories I'd never hear, all the quiet wisdom I'd never receive. Death has a way of making you realize how much you took someone's presence for granted, even when you thought you were paying attention. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week, which seemed unnecessarily formal for someone who'd lived such a modest life. James Harrison had been Grandpa Bob's attorney for over 25 years, handling everything from his mortgage refinancing to his retirement planning. Harrison and Associates occupied a small but dignified building on Main Street, the kind of place where the receptionist had worked there since the Carter administration and knew everyone's business before they walked through the door. I assumed the will reading was just a formality, a legal requirement that would confirm what everyone already knew. Marcus would inherit the house and whatever savings Grandpa Bob had managed to accumulate over the years. As the older child and the one with a family to support, Marcus was the obvious choice for the bulk of the inheritance. I expected to receive some small keepsake, maybe Grandpa Bob's toolbox or his collection of baseball cards, something sentimental but not particularly valuable. The morning of the will reading, I woke up with a headache that felt like it had been building for days. I'd been sleeping poorly since the funeral, waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning with a restless energy that wouldn't let me fall back asleep. I made coffee in my chipped blue mug, and sat at my small kitchen table, watching the sun rise over the neighbor's fence and trying to mentally prepare myself for whatever emotions the day might bring. I dressed carefully in my one good black dress, the same one I'd worn to the funeral, and drove downtown to Harrison and Associates with the radio turned low and my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The parking lot was already full when I arrived, with Marcus's white BMW taking up 2 spaces near the front entrance in a way that seemed both accidental and completely intentional. Harrison and Associates felt like stepping into a time capsule from the reception area was decorated in warm browns and muted golds, with landscape paintings of Iowa farmland hanging in gilded frames that had probably been expensive when they were purchased decades ago. Mrs. Henderson, the receptionist, had been working there since before I was born and greeted everyone by name with the kind of genuine warmth that made you feel like you were visiting a favorite aunt, rather than conducting legal business. James Harrison himself was a man who seemed to have been born wearing a 3-piece suit. At 65 he had the kind of distinguished appearance that made people automatically trust him with their most important documents and family secrets. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, his shoes were always polished to a mirror shine, and his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who'd spent decades choosing his words carefully. He'd known my grandfather since the early days of his practice, back when Cedar Falls was smaller and everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. I arrived at the office 10 minutes early, a habit I'd developed as a teacher because being late felt like letting down 26 8-year-olds who were counting on me to have my act together. The waiting room was already occupied by my parents, who sat side by side on a burgundy leather couch that had seen better decades. My mother was clutching her purse in her lap like she was afraid someone might snatch it, while my father sat with his hands folded and his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere above my head. They both looked uncomfortable, the way people do when they're forced to deal with legal matters they don't fully understand. Marcus swept in 5 minutes later, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and the energy of someone who'd just closed a major deal. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, with a tie that was just flashy enough to suggest success without crossing the line into ostentation. His smile was bright and confident as he greeted everyone with the kind of enthusiasm that made you wonder if he'd forgotten we were there to discuss our grandfather's death or if he was just that skilled at compartmentalizing grief and opportunity. My cousin Jessica arrived with her husband Tom, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else but somehow obligated to attend because family duty demanded. Jessica worked at the bank downtown and had always treated family gatherings like networking opportunities, asking pointed questions about everyone's careers and financial situations, with the kind of nosiness that she disguised as genuine interest. Tom was a quiet man who sold insurance and seemed to spend most family events wishing he was home watching golf tournaments. Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, completed our small gather. She was the kind of woman who collected other people's business like some people collect stamps, always eager to be the first to know about divorces, job losses, and family scandals. She taught high school English and had the ability to make anyone feel like they were being graded on their life choices whenever she looked at them. Her presence at the will reading wasn't legally necessary, but she'd never missed an opportunity to be present for family drama. James Harrison emerged from his office at exactly 2 o'clock, consulting the gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father and greeting us with the professional sympathy that comes from decades of helping families navigate the legal aftermath of law. He invited us into the conference room, a space that managed to feel both formal and comfortable, with a long oak table surrounded by leather chairs that had probably been expensive when they were new sometime during the Reagan administration. The room smelled like furniture polish and old paper, with undertones of the coffee that Mrs. Henderson had been brewing in the same pot for what seemed like decades. Natural light filtered through heavy curtains that had been drawn back just enough to illuminate the table where several manila folders were arranged with military precision. A portrait of some long-dead Iowa judge hung on the wall behind Harrison's chair, lending an air of gravity to the proceedings. Harrison took his place at the head of the table and opened the folder that contained Grandpa Bob's last will and testament. The document was surprisingly thick for someone who'd lived such a modest life, but Harrison explained that modern legal requirements meant even simple wills required extensive documentation and precise language to avoid potential dispute. He began reading in the measured tones of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times, starting with the standard legal preamble that established Grandpa Bob's identity and mental competence at the time the will was drafted. The formal language was exactly what you'd expect from a legal document. I, Robert James Mitchell, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby make, publish and declare this to be my last will and testament. Harrison's voice was steady and professional as he worked through the preliminary sections, explaining that the will had been updated 18 months ago, and that Grandpa Bob had been very specific about his wishes regarding the distribution of his assets. My mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing at Marcus with the kind of pride that suggested she was already mentally spending his inheritance on grandchildren's college funds and family vacation. Marcus himself was trying to look appropriately somber, but there was an energy about him that reminded me of a runner waiting for the starting gun. He kept adjusting his tie and checking his phone, presumably for messages from clients who needed his immediate attention even during family legal proceedings. When Harrison reached the section dealing with specific bequests, the atmosphere in the room shifted suddenly. Everyone leaned forward slightly, even those who weren't expecting to inherit anything significant. There's something about the formal reading of a will that makes people pay attention in a way that casual conversation never does, as if the legal language carries more weight than ordinary words. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading the details of Grandpa Bob's estate. The primary asset was the house on Maple Avenue, a modest two-story structure that had been home to 3 generations of Mitch. The house wasn't fancy, but it was solid and well-maintained, with a large backyard and a detached garage that Grandpa Bob had used as a workshop for his various repair projects. In Cedar Falls' current real estate market, the house would probably sell for around $150,000, which represented the bulk of Grandpa Bob's worldly wealth. The secondary assets included Grandpa Bob's pickup truck, a 201 Ford F-150 that had been reliable transportation for over 2 decades despite its accumulated dents and rust spots. There was also his savings account at First National Bank, which contained approximately $45,000 that he'd accumulated through careful budgeting and modest investments over the years. For a man who'd worked in a factory and raised 4 children on a blue-collar salary, it was a respectable amount that reflected decades of careful financial management. Harrison's voice remained steady and professional as he read Marcus's name in connection with these major assets. To my grandson Marcus David Mitchell, I leave my primary residence located at 412 Maple Avenue, Cedar Falls, Iowa, including all fixtures, improvements and personal property contained therein, with the exception of items specifically designated elsewhere in this document. The relief in the room was palpable. Marcus smiled and nodded, as if he'd been expecting this outcome all along, while my mother reached over and squeezed his hand in a gesture of congratulation. My father maintained his stoic expression, but I could see the tension leave his shoulders as the major question of inheritance was resolved in favor of family expectation. Harrison continued reading the specifics of Marcus's inheritance, which included the pickup truck, the savings account and most of Grandpa Bob's tools and workshop equipment. The total value was probably close to $200,000, which would be enough to pay off Marcus's credit cards and provide a significant boost to his financial situation. For someone who'd been living on commission income and credit card advances, this inheritance represented real security and the possibility of building something more substantial than his current lifestyle allowed. As Harrison worked through the details of Marcus's inheritance, I found myself feeling genuinely happy for my brother despite our complicated relationship. Marcus had always been the kind of person who lived beyond his means, financing his dreams with optimism and credit application. This inheritance would give him the chance to get ahead of his debts and maybe develop some financial stability that would benefit his future family. Grandpa Bob had always been generous with Marcus during his lifetime, so it made sense that this final gift would be equally generous. The reading continued with smaller bequests to other family members. My parents would receive Grandpa Bob's collection of Cubs memorabilia, including several autographed baseballs and programs from games dating back to the 90s. Aunt Carol would inherit his collection of books, mostly paperback westerns and biographies of baseball players, along with the antique rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother. Cousin Jessica would receive Grandpa Bob's stamp collection, which wasn't particularly valuable but reflected his lifelong interest in geography and travel. These smaller gifts were touching in their specificity, revealing that Grandpa Bob had been paying attention to people's interests and hobbies even when his memory was becoming unreliable. The Cubs memorabilia was perfect for my father, who'd inherited his love of baseball from his own father and spent summer evenings listening to games on the radio. The books were appropriate for Aunt Carol, who'd always been a voracious reader and had often brought new paperbacks to family gatherings to share with anyone who was interested. As Harrison worked through these smaller bequests, I realized that my name hadn't been mentioned yet. I wasn't particularly concerned, assuming that my inheritance would be listed among the final items, probably something sentimental like Grandpa Bob's Bible or his collection of family photographs. I'd never expected to receive anything of significant monetary value, and I was genuinely happy that Marcus would inherit the assets that would make the biggest difference in his life. But then Harrison reached the end of the formal bequests and paused, consulting his notes with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was about to address something unusual. He looked up from the document and made eye contact with each person in the room, as if he wanted to ensure that everyone was paying attention to what came next. To my granddaughter Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, Harrison, his voice carrying the same professional tone he'd used throughout the reading, I leave $1 silver, specifically the 1921 Morgan silver dollar currently in my possession, along with my personal journal and the leather satchel in which it is kept. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke, as if everyone was waiting for Harrison to continue reading and reveal that this was just the beginning of a longer bequest. But Harrison closed the folder and set it aside, indicating that the reading was complete. Marcus was the first to break the silence, and he did it with a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh, as if he wasn't sure whether what he'd just heard was supposed to be funny or tragic. The sound seemed to give everyone else permission to react, and the room suddenly filled with the kind of uncomfortable energy that comes when people are trying to process something unexpected. Jessica actually started giggling, a high-pitched sound that she tried to cover with her hand but couldn't quite suppress. The giggling was infectious in the worst possible way, and soon Tom was making small choking sounds that might have been suppressed laughter. Even my mother seemed to be fighting back some kind of reaction, though whether it was amusement or embarrassment was impossible to tell. My father remained silent, but I could see him processing the information with the kind of careful consideration he brought to all family situations. He was probably running calculations in his head, trying to understand the reasoning behind Grandpa Bob's decision and whether there was some deeper meaning that the rest of us were missing. Aunt Carol was the first to speak, and her voice carried the kind of artificial sympathy that made her words feel worse than silence. "Well, honey," she said, addressing me directly, "I suppose your grandfather knew you didn't really need much. You've always been so independent and self-sufficient." The word independent hung in the air like a euphemism for something less charitable. In our family, calling someone independent was often code for saying they were difficult to help or unwilling to accept assistance. It was the kind of backhanded compliment that made generosity seem unnecessary and self-reliance seem like a character flaw. Marcus had recovered from his initial reaction and was now trying to look appropriately sympathetic, though his efforts weren't entirely convincing. "I'm sure there's more to it than that," he said, his voice carrying the kind of forced sincerity that real estate agents use when they're trying to put a positive spin on a house with foundation problems. Maybe the journal has some kind of sentimental value that we don't understand yet. Harrison maintained his professional demeanor throughout this exchange, but I could see that he was uncomfortable with the family's reaction. He'd probably presided over hundreds of will readings over the years, and he'd undoubtedly seen every possible family dynamic play out in this conference room. He knew the difference between disappointment and humiliation, and he was skilled enough to recognize when someone was being treated unfairly. "If there are no questions about the provisions of the will," Harrison said, his voice carrying a subtle note of authority that suggested it was time to conclude the proceedings, "I'll have Mrs. Henderson prepare the necessary paperwork for the transfer of assets. Marcus, if you could stop by sometime next week, we'll handle the deed transfer and the other legal requirements." Marcus nodded eagerly, already reaching for his phone to check his calendar and schedule the appointment. The prospect of finalizing his inheritance had restored his natural enthusiasm, and he was back to being the confident, successful person he'd always presented himself as. He shook Harrison's hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested he was ready to move forward with his new financial reality. As everyone began gathering their belongings and making small talk about the weather and their plans for the rest of the day, I found myself sitting very still in my leather chair, trying to process what had just happened. The silver dollar and journal were sitting on the table in front of me, wrapped in a small cloth bag that looked like it had been carefully prepared for this moment. The silver dollar was surprisingly heavy when I picked it up, with the kind of weight that suggested it was made of real silver rather than the lightweight coins that had replaced precious metals in modern currency. The date was clearly visible, 1921, making it over a century old. The design was beautiful, with Lady Liberty on one side and an eagle on the other, but I had no idea whether it had any value beyond its silver content. The journal was bound in brown leather that had been worn smooth by decades of handling. It was about the size of a paperback book, with a leather strap that wrapped around it to keep it closed. The cover was unmarked except for some faint scratches that might have been initials or might have been random wear from being carried in a pocket or satchel. The leather satchel itself was small and utilitarian, the kind of bag that might have been used to carry tools or personal items to work every day. As I examined these items, I became aware that the room had grown quiet again, and that everyone was watching me with the kind of attention that made me feel like I was being evaluated or judged. There was something about their collective gaze that made me feel exposed and vulnerable, as if my disappointment or confusion was visible on my face for everyone to see. I realized that this was one of those moments that would define how people saw me and how I saw myself. I could react with hurt or anger, demanding to know why I'd been excluded from any meaningful inheritance. I could challenge the will or question Harrison about whether there had been some kind of mistake. I could make a scene that would give my family something to talk about for years to come. Instead, I wrapped the silver dollar and journal carefully in their cloth bag and placed them in my purse with the kind of deliberate care that suggested they were precious to me regardless of their monetary value. I stood up slowly, smoothed my dress, and thanked Harrison for his time and professionalism. I hugged my parents and told Marcus I was happy for him and hoped the inheritance would bring him security and happiness. Then I walked out of Harrison and Associates and into the bright Iowa afternoon, carrying my inheritance in my purse and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with the strange mix of emotions that were churning in my chest. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and life in Cedar Falls was continuing exactly as it had before I learned that my grandfather had valued my presence in his life at approximately $1. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets and automatic responses to traffic lights and stop signs. I found myself thinking about all the Sunday afternoons I'd spent at Grandpa Bob's house, helping him with household chores and listening to his stories about the old days. I thought about all the times he'd quietly helped me with small financial emergencies, slipping me money for car repairs or grocery bills without making a big deal about it. I thought about the way he'd always seemed genuinely interested in my students and my work, asking detailed questions about their progress and my teaching methods. Had I misunderstood our relationship? Had I been projecting emotions and connections that weren't really there? Had I been so focused on being the good granddaughter that I'd failed to notice that he didn't actually value my presence in his life? By the time I reached my duplex on Elm Street, I was emotionally exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the day. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the house that would never be mine, and trying to process the fact that my grandfather had essentially left me nothing while giving Marcus enough to change his life significantly. Inside my small kitchen, I made coffee in my chipped blue mug, and sat at my table with the cloth bag containing my inheritance. The silver dollar was beautiful in an antique way, with the kind of craftsmanship that modern coins lack. The journal was obviously old and well used, with pages that had been filled with Grandpa Bob's careful handwriting. The leather satchel was worn but sturdy, suggesting it had been used regularly for decades. I opened the journal carefully, expecting to find appointment reminders or grocery lists, or the kind of mundane record-keeping that elderly people sometimes maintain. Instead, I found pages of detailed notes about investments, stock purchases, and financial calculations that seemed far too sophisticated for a retired factory worker. The handwriting was definitely Grandpa Bob's, but the content was unlike anything I'd ever associated with him. The first entry was dated 35 years ago, just a few months after Grandpa Bob had retired from the John Deere plant. It described the purchase of 50 shares of a company I'd never heard of, along with careful notes about the reasoning behind the investment and the potential for long-term growth. The entry was followed by regular updates tracking the performance of the stock and additional purchases made when the price dipped below certain thresholds. As I continued reading, I realized that the journal contained a comprehensive record of an investment strategy that had been implemented over decades with the kind of patience and discipline that professional financial advisors recommend, but rarely see in practice. Grandpa Bob had been quietly building a portfolio of stocks, bonds, and other investments, while maintaining his reputation as a frugal retiree who clipped coupons and drove an old pickup truck. The numbers in the journal were staggering. Even accounting for inflation and market fluctuations, the investments described in these pages represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital that had been carefully deployed over decades. Some of the companies mentioned were ones I recognized as major corporations, suggesting that Grandpa Bob had been making sophisticated investment decisions long before online trading and financial websites made such information easily accessible. But the most shocking discovery was on the last page of the journal, written in Grandpa Bob's careful handwriting just a few months before his death. It was a summary of his total investment portfolio, including accounts at banks and brokerage firms that I'd never known existed. The numbers were so large that I had to read them 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the notation. According to this final entry, Grandpa Bob had accumulated investment assets worth over $100 million. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the journal and feeling like I'd discovered a secret that would change everything I thought I knew about my grandfather and my family. The man who'd lived in a modest house and driven an old pickup truck had been secretly managing a fortune that would have made him one of the wealthiest people in Iowa. The grandfather who'd written small checks to help Marcus with his various financial emergencies had been sitting on assets that could have solved everyone's problems permanently. But why had he kept this secret? And why had he left me only a silver dollar and a journal when he had access to wealth that could have changed my entire life? The questions were overwhelming, and I found myself crying for the first time since his death, not from grief, but from confusion and a growing sense that there was much more to this story than I understood. The phone rang while I was still sitting at my kitchen table, trying to process what I'd learned. The caller ID showed Harrison and Associates, and I assumed it was Mrs. Henderson calling about some procedural detail related to the will reading. Instead, it was James Harrison himself, and his voice carried a note of urgency that hadn't been present during the formal proceedings. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling you at home," he said, his professional tone softened by what sounded like genuine concern. "I wanted to speak with you privately about a matter that your grandfather specifically requested I handle separately from the will reading." My heart started beating faster, and I found myself gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "What kind of matter, Mr. Harris?" "I'd prefer to discuss it in person, if you don't mind," he said. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions about this, and I think it would be best if we met privately in my office. Would you be able to come in tomorrow morning, around 10 o'clock? I agreed to the meeting, though I had no idea what to expect. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen as the afternoon light faded into evening, holding the journal and trying to understand what my grandfather had been thinking when he'd made his final arrangement. The silver dollar caught the light from my kitchen window, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to my inheritance than anyone had understood. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw numbers from Grandpa Bob's journal floating in the darkness like some kind of fever dream. $100 million. The figure was so enormous that my mind couldn't properly process it, like trying to visualize the distance to the moon or the number of stars in the galaxy. I kept getting up to reread the final entry, checking and rechecking the calculations, convinced that I must have misunderstood something fundamental about what I was seeing. The morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that makes you want to stay inside with hot coffee and avoid making important decisions. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, but the thought of trying to teach 26 third graders about multiplication tables, while my mind was spinning with questions about secret fortunes, felt impossible. Mrs. Patterson, the school secretary, sounded concerned when I called, probably because I'd used exactly 3 sick days in the past 2 years. I spent the early morning hours pacing around my small duplex, the journal open on my kitchen table like evidence in a crime I didn't understand. I reread sections at random, trying to make sense of the timeline and the strategy behind Grandpa Bob's investments. The entries were methodical and detailed, showing a level of financial sophistication that seemed completely at odds with the man I'd known my entire life. One entry from 15 years ago caught my attention because it mentioned Marcus by name. Grandpa Bob had written about loaning Marcus $5,000 for a down payment on his first house, money that had never been repaid despite multiple promises and good intention. But what struck me wasn't the loan itself, which I remembered, but Grandpa Bob's analysis of the situation. He'd written, Marcus sees money as a solution to immediate problems rather than a tool for building security. This pattern suggests he would not benefit from sudden wealth and might be harmed by it. Another entry from around the same time period mentioned me, though in a completely different context. Grandpa Bob had noted that I'd turned down his offer to help pay off my student loans, insisting that I wanted to handle the debt myself even though it meant living paycheck to paycheck for years. His comment was simple but telling. Sarah understands that money earned has different value than money given. She makes sacrifices for principles rather than convenience. These observations suggested that Grandpa Bob had been carefully studying our family dynamics for years, analyzing our relationships with money and responsibility like a behavioral scientist conducting a long-term experiment. The journal wasn't just a record of investments, it was a record of his assessment of our characters and our fitness to handle significant wealth. By 9:30 I was ready to leave for my appointment with James Harrison, though I had no idea what to expect from our meeting. I drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past the elementary school where I should have been teaching, past the diner where Grandpa Bob used to take me for pancakes on special occasions, past all the familiar landmarks that suddenly felt different now that I knew he'd been harboring such an enormous secret. Harrison and Associates looked exactly the same as it had the day before, but the atmosphere felt different when I walked through the front door. Miss Henderson greeted me with the same warm smile, but there was something in her expression that suggested she knew more about the purpose of my visit than she was letting on. She led me directly to Miss Harrison's private office rather than the conference room, a space that felt more intimate and less formal than where we'd conducted the will reading. James Harrison's office was a study in professional understated elegance. The walls were lined with law books that looked like they'd actually been read rather than purchased for decoration. His desk was massive and organized with neat stacks of documents and a leather desk pad that had probably been expensive when it was new sometime during the Bush administration. Family photos in silver frames showed Harrison with his wife and children at various stages of their lives, creating a sense of continuity and stability that made you trust him with important matters. Harrison stood when I entered, gesturing for me to take one of the 2 leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. He looked more serious than he had during the will reading, with the kind of focused attention that lawyers develop when they're about to discuss something genuinely significant. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a carafe on a side table, asking if I wanted cream or sugar with the kind of careful politeness that suggested he was nervous about our conversation. Sarah, he began, settling into his chair and folding his hands on his desk, I want to start by saying that your grandfather was one of the most remarkable men I've ever had the privilege to know, both personally and professionally. What I'm about to share with you will probably come as quite a shock, and I want you to know that everything we discuss today is completely confidential. I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. The coffee was hot and strong, giving me something to focus on while I tried to prepare myself for whatever revelation was coming. Your grandfather came to see me about 4 years ago with a very unusual request, Harrison continued. He wanted to create a separate legal structure that would be completely independent of his will, something that wouldn't become part of the public record when his estate was settled. He was very specific about his reasons for this arrangement, and he was equally specific about his instructions for how and when this information should be shared. Harrison opened a file folder that had been sitting on his desk and removed a sealed envelope with my name written on it, in Grandpa Bob's careful handwriting. The envelope was thick and heavy, suggesting it contained more than just a simple letter. Harrison handed it to me with the kind of ceremonial gravity that made it clear this was a significant moment. Your grandfather asked me to give this to you personally, and only if you came to this meeting alone, Harrison said. He was very insistent about that condition. He also asked me to tell you that everything in that envelope represents his complete confidence in your judgment, and his belief in your character. My hands were shaking slightly as I took the envelope. The paper was expensive stationery, heavier than normal letter paper, and the seal was made with red wax that had been pressed with what looked like Grandpa Bob's initials. The formality of the presentation made it clear that whatever was inside had been prepared with great care and deliberation. Should I open it now, or would you prefer that I read it privately? I asked, though part of me was afraid to open it at all. Your grandfather specifically requested that you read it here in my presence, Harrison said. He wanted me to be available to answer any questions you might have about the legal and financial implications of what he's arranged. I broke the wax seal carefully, trying not to damage the envelope more than necessary. Inside were several documents, a handwritten letter from Grandpa Bob, what looked like legal papers, and some kind of official banking documentation. I started with the letter, unfolding it slowly and recognizing his familiar handwriting immediately. My dear Sarah, the letter began, if you're reading this, then I've already left this world, and you've discovered that I left you what must have seemed like an insulting inheritance. I hope you can forgive an old man for the deception, but I needed to be certain that my decision was based on your true character rather than any expectations about what you might receive. I paused in my reading, looking up at Harrison, who was watching me with patient attention. Did you know what he was planning? I asked. I knew about the separate arrangement, Harrison replied, but your grandfather never told me the specific amounts involved or his complete reasoning. He was very private about his personal financial situation, even with his attorney. I returned to the letter, my heart beating faster with each sentence. Over the past 35 years, I've been managing investments that have grown far beyond what anyone in our family could imagine. This success wasn't due to luck or special knowledge, but rather to patience, discipline, and the willingness to think in terms of decades rather than months. I've been preparing for this moment since you were a child, watching and evaluating how each member of our family handles money, responsibility, and opportunity. The letter continued with Grandpa Bob's analysis of different family members, written with the kind of blunt honesty that only comes from someone who no longer has to worry about hurting feelings or maintaining relationships. His assessment of Marcus was particularly direct. Marcus is a good man with a generous heart, but he views money as a tool for immediate gratification rather than long-term security. The inheritance he received will improve his life significantly without overwhelming his ability to handle it responsibly. His observations about my parents were similarly candid but more sympathetic. He understood that they'd worked hard their entire lives and deserved security in their retirement, but he also recognized that sudden wealth would create more anxiety than happiness for people who'd built their identities around careful budgeting and modest expectations. But it was his assessment of me that made my eyes fill with tears. Sarah, you've always been the family member who gives more than she takes, who works harder than necessary, and who makes sacrifices for principles that other people might consider impractical. You've never asked me for money even when you were struggling, and you've never treated our relationship as an opportunity for financial gain. Most importantly, you've shown me that you understand the difference between having money and being controlled by it. The letter went on to explain that he'd been testing all of us for years, carefully observing how we responded to small financial gifts and opportunities. He'd noticed that Marcus always spent money as quickly as he received it, viewing each gift as permission to take on more debt or make more ambitious purchases. He'd seen that my parents, while grateful for his help, were always slightly uncomfortable accepting money and never asked for more than they absolutely needed. But with me, he'd observed something different. When he'd offered to pay off my student loans, I'd declined not out of pride but out of a desire to earn my freedom from debt. When he'd slipped me money for car repairs or grocery bills, I'd always paid him back even when he insisted it was a gift. When he'd given me money for Christmas or my birthday, I'd typically spent it on my students or donated it to causes I cared about rather than buying things for myself. These patterns told me everything I needed to know about your character. The letter continued. You understand that money is a tool for creating opportunities and helping others, not an end in itself. You have the discipline to handle significant wealth without being corrupted by it, and you have the wisdom to use it in ways that would make me proud. The next section of the letter explained the practical details of what he'd arranged. Over the past 35 years, Grandpa Bob had been working with a small network of financial advisors and investment managers to build a diversified portfolio of assets. He'd started with his retirement savings and a modest inheritance from his own parents, investing consistently and reinvesting all dividends and capital gains, rather than spending them. The investment strategy had been conservative but persistent, focusing on blue-chip stocks, real estate investment trusts, and government bonds rather than speculative investments or get-rich-quick schemes. He'd weathered multiple market downturns by maintaining his positions and buying more shares when prices dropped, taking advantage of compound growth over decades, rather than trying to time the market for short-term gain. The results, according to the letter, had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The portfolio was now worth approximately $112 million, held in a complex trust structure that had been designed to minimize tax implications and maximize flexibility for distribution. The trust was domiciled in Delaware for legal purposes, but managed by a firm in Chicago that specialized in handling ultra-high net worth clients. This money is now yours, Sarah, with only one condition. You must use it wisely and in ways that honor the values we've shared. I'm not dictating how you should spend it or invest it, because I trust your judgment completely. I only ask that you remember that great wealth comes with great responsibility, and that the best way to honor money is to use it to create opportunities for others. The letter concluded with personal reflections that made me cry openly in Harrison's office. Grandpa Bob wrote about how proud he was of the woman I'd become, how much he'd enjoyed our Sunday afternoon visits, and how confident he was that I would use this inheritance to make a positive difference in the world. He acknowledged that the deception had been difficult for him, especially during his final months, when he'd wanted to tell me the truth but had been committed to his plan. I hope you can forgive me for the charade at the will reading, he wrote. I needed to see how the family would react to the appearance of favoritism toward Marcus, and I needed to ensure that your inheritance remained private until you were ready to handle it. James Harrison has all the legal documentation necessary to transfer the assets to your control, and he's prepared to help you understand the responsibilities that come with this kind of wealth. The final paragraph was written in slightly shakier handwriting, as if he'd been tired or emotional when he'd composed it. Remember, sweetheart, that money doesn't change who you are unless you let it. You've always been the person in our family who sees what needs to be done and does it quietly, without expecting recognition or reward. This money will give you the power to do those things on a much larger scale, but I trust you to remain the same caring, thoughtful person you've always been. Use this gift to build something beautiful in the world. I set the letter down on Harrison's desk and sat quietly for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just read. The amount of money was so large that it felt abstract, like a number in an economics textbook rather than something that belonged to me. But more than the financial implications, I was struggling with the emotional weight of realizing how carefully Grandpa Bob had been planning this moment, and how much thought he'd put into his decision. Harrison waited patiently while I composed myself, offering tissues and refilling my coffee cup without asking if I wanted more. When I finally looked up at him, he was regarding me with the kind of professional sympathy that comes from decades of helping people navigate life-changing situations. I have to ask, I said, my voice still shaky from crying, is this real? Is the money actually there? Or is this some kind of mistake or misunderstanding? Harrison opened another file folder and removed a stack of official-looking documents. I've been in contact with the trust administrators in Chicago, and I can confirm that the assets are real and properly documented. Your grandfather was very thorough in his planning, and everything has been structured to ensure a smooth transfer of ownership. He showed me bank statements, investment summaries, and legal documents that confirmed the existence of the Robert Mitchell Trust and my status as the sole beneficiary. The numbers were staggering: stock portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars, real estate investments across multiple states, government bonds and cash reserves that exceeded the annual budget of some small city. The trust has been generating significant income over the years, Harrison explained, but your grandfather instructed the managers to reinvest everything rather than taking distribution. The compound growth has been extraordinary, particularly over the past 15 years as the stock market has performed well. I studied the documents, trying to understand the scope of what I was inheriting. There were commercial real estate properties in Chicago, Minneapolis and Des Moines. There were stock holdings in dozens of major corporations, many of which paid substantial dividends. There were municipal bonds from various states and treasury bills that provided steady, predictable income. What happens next? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what Grandpa Bob had created. The trust administrators are expecting your call, Harrison said, handing me a business card with contact information for a firm called Midwest Wealth Management. They've been managing these assets for your grandfather for over 20 years, and they're prepared to continue doing so under your direction. You don't have to make any immediate decisions about changes or distributions, but you'll need to establish your identity as the new beneficiary and discuss your goals for the assets. Harrison went on to explain some of the practical implications of inheriting such a large amount of money. There would be tax considerations. Though the trust structure had been designed to minimize the immediate impact, there would be ongoing management fees and administrative costs, though these were relatively small percentages of the total assets. Most importantly, there would be decisions to make about how to use the income generated by the investments and whether to maintain the current investment strategy or make changes based on my own priorities and values. Your grandfather also left instructions about maintaining privacy regarding this inheritance. Harrison added, the trust structure ensures that the assets won't appear in any public records associated with his estate, and the will reading yesterday dealt only with his personal property and local bank accounts. As far as your family and the community are concerned, Marcus inherited everything of significant value. This aspect of the arrangement was both a relief and a burden. I was grateful that I wouldn't have to deal with the family drama and community attention that would inevitably follow if people knew about the true extent of Grandpa Bob's wealth. But I also felt the weight of keeping such an enormous secret, especially from people I cared about who were struggling with their own financial challenges. Can I ask you something, Mr. Harrison? I said, looking at the business card for Midwest Wealth Management. Did my grandfather ever explain why he chose to do things this way? Why not just tell the family about his success and share the wealth while he was alive? Harrison considered the question carefully before answering. We discussed this several times over the years, and his reasoning evolved as he got older. Initially, I think he was concerned about how sudden wealth might change family dynamics and individual motivation. He'd seen other families destroyed by inheritance disputes, and children who lost their drive to work because they expected to inherit money. Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully. But as he got older and his health declined, I think his motivation became more specific to you personally. He told me once that he wanted to give you something that would allow you to pursue your own vision of what mattered, rather than what other people expected of you. He felt that if the family knew about his wealth, you'd face pressure to use it in ways that might not align with your own values and priorities. This explanation resonated with something I'd felt but hadn't been able to articulate. Grandpa Bob had always been the family member who seemed to see me most clearly, who understood that my choice to become a teacher wasn't about settling for less but about choosing something that mattered to me. He'd recognized that my reluctance to accept financial help wasn't about pride but about wanting to build my own life on my own terms. There's one more thing, Harrison said, reaching into his desk drawer. Your grandfather asked me to give you this when we met today. He handed me a small wrapped package, about the size of a paperback book. Inside the wrapping was a framed photograph I'd never seen before. It showed Grandpa Bob as a young man, probably in his 30s, standing in front of what looked like a factory gate with several other men in work clothes. They were all smiling, and Grandpa Bob had his arm around another worker's shoulders in a gesture of friendship and camaraderie. On the back of the frame he'd written a note, This is who I was before I became wealthy. Don't ever forget that money should serve you, not the other way around. The photograph was a reminder that Grandpa Bob had been a working man who'd built his fortune through patience and discipline rather than inheritance or luck. He'd understood the value of money because he'd worked hard to earn it, and he'd maintained his perspective on what really mattered even as his wealth grew beyond anything he could have imagined when the photograph was taken. As I prepared to leave Harrison's office, carrying documents that represented more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, I found myself thinking about the silver dollar that had seemed like such an insult just 24 hours earlier. Now I understood that it wasn't meant to be my inheritance at all, but rather a symbol of Grandpa Bob's belief in starting small and building something significant over time. The silver dollar was from 1921. It represented the beginning of a century during which he'd transformed himself from a factory worker's son into one of the wealthiest people in Iowa, all while maintaining the values and humility that had defined his character. He'd given me that coin not as an insult but as a reminder that the most important things often start small and grow through careful attention over time. Walking out of Harrison and Associates and into the gray October afternoon, I felt like I was entering a completely different world than the one I'd inhabited just 2 days earlier. The same streets, the same buildings, the same familiar landmarks of Cedar Falls, but now I was seeing them through the eyes of someone who had the resources to change things, to make a difference, to build something meaningful. But with that realization came a weight of responsibility that was almost overwhelming. Grandpa Bob had entrusted me with not just his money, but his faith in my judgment, and his confidence in my character. He'd spent years observing and evaluating, testing and preparing, to ensure that his life's work would continue in hands that would honor his values and his memory. As I drove home to my small duplex on Elm Street, I found myself thinking about my students at Lincoln Elementary and the look in their eyes when they talked about their dreams and aspirations. I thought about Tyler, who lingered after school because he didn't want to go to an empty house, and Emma, who struggled with reading but had so much potential waiting to be unlocked. I thought about Maria, who was learning to navigate between 2 languages and 2 cultures, and all the other children who deserved every opportunity to build the lives they imagined for themselves. For the first time since I'd opened Grandpa Bob's letter, I began to understand what he'd meant about using money to create opportunities for others. This inheritance wasn't just about changing my life. It was about changing the lives of people who needed someone to believe in them and invest in their potential. It was about building something that would last long after I was gone, something that would honor the memory of a man who'd understood that the greatest wealth comes from helping others discover their own value. The business card for Midwest Wealth Management sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I worked up the courage to make the phone call. Every time I reached for my phone, I found myself paralyzed by the magnitude of what I was about to do. Calling that number would make everything real in a way that reading documents and letters couldn't. Once I spoke with the trust administrators, there would be no going back to my simple life as Sarah Mitchell, elementary school teacher from Cedar Falls, Iowa. During those 3 days, I continued going to work as if nothing had changed, standing in front of my classroom, teaching multiplication tables and reading comprehension, while carrying the secret of $100 million inheritance. My students noticed that I seemed distracted, and several of them asked if I was feeling okay. Emma brought me a drawing of a smiling sun with "Get well soon, Miss Mitchell" written in careful 3rd grade cursive, which made me realize that my internal turmoil was more visible than I'd thought. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was teaching children about numbers and mathematics, while struggling to comprehend numbers so large they seemed fictional. When Tyler raised his hand to ask why anyone would ever need to know how to multiply 4-digit numbers, I found myself thinking about compound interest and investment growth over decades, concepts that would have seemed as abstract to him as my inheritance still felt to me. On Thursday evening, I finally picked up the phone and dialed the number Harrison had given me. The receptionist at Midwest Wealth Management had a professional warmth that suggested the firm was accustomed to dealing with clients who might be intimidated by the world of high finance. When I identified myself as Sarah Mitchell and mentioned that I was calling about the Robert Mitchell Trust, I was immediately transferred to someone named Catherine Reynolds, who seemed to have been expecting my call. Catherine Reynolds, had the kind of confident voice that made you believe she could handle any financial complexity with ease. She explained that she'd been working with my grandfather for over 15 years, and had been waiting for this conversation since his passing. She offered her condolences and assured me that Midwest Wealth Management was prepared to help me understand and manage the inheritance in whatever way felt most comfortable for me. Your grandfather was very specific about wanting to ensure a smooth transition, Catherine explained. He understood that this inheritance might be overwhelming initially, and he wanted us to provide as much or as little guidance as you prefer. We're here to serve your interests and help you achieve whatever goals you set for these assets. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday at their offices in Chicago, which would give me time to arrange a substitute teacher and prepare myself mentally for what felt like the most important appointment of my life. Catherine offered to send a car service to pick me up in Cedar Falls, an offer that made me realize I was entering a world where such conveniences were routine rather than extravagant. The weekend passed slowly, filled with restless energy and sleepless nights. I found myself walking through Cedar Falls with new eyes, noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The elementary school where I worked needed a new roof, better playground equipment, and updated technology in every classroom. The public library was operating with reduced hours due to budget cuts. The community center where local families gathered for events was showing its age in ways that small-town budgets couldn't address. For the first time in my life, I had the power to solve these problems, but I also had the responsibility to think carefully about how to use that power wisely. Grandpa Bob's letter had emphasized the importance of creating opportunities for others, but he'd left the specific decisions up to me. The weight of that trust was both exhilarating and terrifying. On Sunday afternoon, I drove to Grandpa Bob's house on Maple Avenue, which Marcus had inherited but hadn't yet moved into. The key was still hidden under the flower pot by the back door, exactly where it had been for as long as I could remember. I let myself in and spent an hour walking through the rooms where I'd spent so many Sunday afternoons, trying to reconcile the modest surroundings with the knowledge of the fortune that had been managed from this same kitchen table. The house felt different now that I understood the full story. The simple furniture and worn carpet weren't signs of frugality but of priorities. Grandpa Bob had chosen to live modestly not because he couldn't afford better but because comfort and status weren't important to him. He'd invested in growth and opportunity rather than luxury, building something that would outlast any material possessions. In his bedroom, I found a small desk that I'd never paid much attention to before. Now I realized this was probably where he'd managed his investments, where he'd made the decisions that had transformed a factory worker's retirement savings into generational wealth. The desk was empty now, but I could imagine him sitting there in the early morning hours, reading financial reports and making careful notes in his journal. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November weather that made Chicago feel like a reasonable destination rather than a distant city. The car service Catherine had arranged was a black sedan with a professional driver who seemed unsurprised by the idea of driving 3 hours each way to transport an elementary school teacher to a wealth management firm. During the drive, I tried to prepare myself for the meeting by reviewing the documents Harrison had given me, but the numbers still felt surreal. Chicago's skyline appeared gradually through the morning mist, a collection of glass and steel towers that represented the kind of financial power I was about to become part of. Midwest Wealth Management occupied several floors of a building in the Loop, with offices that offered sweeping views of Lake Michigan and the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money without being ostentatious about it. Catherine Reynolds was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from decades of helping people navigate complex financial decisions. Her office was spacious but not intimidating, with family photos and awards that suggested both professional competence and personal warmth. She greeted me with genuine sympathy for my loss and obvious enthusiasm for helping me understand what my grandfather had built. Before we discuss the specific assets, Catherine began, I want you to understand how unusual your grandfather was as a client. Most people who accumulate significant wealth do so through business ownership, inheritance, or high-income career. Your grandfather built this portfolio through patient, disciplined investing over decades, starting with very modest amounts and never deviating from his long-term strategy. She showed me charts and graphs that illustrated the growth of the portfolio over time, pointing out how Grandpa Bob had continued investing even during market downturns when other investors were selling in panic. His consistency had been remarkable, adding money to the portfolio every month regardless of market conditions and reinvesting all dividends and capital gains, rather than spending them. The most impressive aspect of his strategy, Catherine continued, was his emotional discipline. He never let fear or greed drive his decisions. During the dot-com crash in 2000, he actually increased his investments, buying quality stocks at reduced prices. During the financial crisis in 2008, he did the same thing. Most people can't maintain that kind of perspective during market volatility. The current portfolio was diversified across multiple asset classes and geographic regions, with holdings in domestic and international stocks, real estate investment trusts, government and corporate bonds, and alternative investments like infrastructure funds and commodities. The annual income generated by these assets was approximately $4 million, money that had been automatically reinvested for decades, but could now be used for current expenses or charitable purposes. Your grandfather left very specific instructions about his wishes for the portfolio, Catherine explained, opening a file that contained several pages of handwritten notes. He wanted us to maintain the conservative investment approach that had been so successful, but he also wanted us to begin incorporating more socially responsible investments that align with values he believed you shared. These instructions revealed another layer of Grandpa Bob's thoughtfulness. He'd been paying attention not just to my financial discipline but to my social consciousness, noting my concern for education, environmental issues, and social justice. He'd asked the investment managers to begin shifting portions of the portfolio toward companies and funds that were working to address these challenges, while still maintaining the growth potential that would ensure the inheritance continued to grow over time. Catherine walked me through the practical aspects of managing such a large portfolio, explaining the quarterly reviews, annual tax planning, and ongoing communication that would be required. She assured me that Midwest Wealth Management was prepared to handle all the administrative details, while keeping me informed about performance and opportunity. The firm had been managing assets for ultra-high net worth families for over 30 years and understood the unique challenges that came with sudden wealth. Many of our clients find that inheriting significant assets changes their perspective on everything from career choices to personal relationships, Catherine said gently. We encourage people to take time to adjust to their new circumstances before making major decisions about lifestyle changes or large distributions. Your grandfather specifically requested that we advise you to live with this knowledge for at least 6 months before making any irreversible choices. This advice reflected Grandpa Bob's wisdom about human nature and the potentially corrupting influence of sudden wealth. He'd understood that having access to unlimited resources could change someone's judgment and priorities in ways that weren't immediately obvious. By encouraging patience and reflection, he was protecting me from the impulsive decisions that had destroyed other lottery winners and inheritance recipients. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, covering everything from tax implications to estate planning to philanthropic strategy. Catherine introduced me to other members of the team who would be involved in managing the portfolio, including tax specialists, estate attorneys, and charitable giving experts. Each person I met seemed to understand that this inheritance represented not just money but a responsibility to use it wisely. As the formal part of the meeting concluded, Catherine asked if I had any questions about the immediate practical steps. The trust was already established and functioning, with all legal documentation properly filed and all assets properly titled. I didn't need to make any decisions about investments or distributions immediately, but I would need to update my personal information and provide new contact details as the beneficiary. There is one more thing your grandfather asked me to share with you, Catherine said, reaching into her desk drawer. He wanted you to have this when you visited our offices for the first time. She handed me a small envelope with my name written in Grandpa Bob's handwriting. Inside was a brief note and a photograph I'd never seen before. The photograph showed Grandpa Bob standing in front of a modest house with a sold sign in the yard. He was wearing work clothes and holding what looked like a check with an expression of quiet satisfaction on his face. The note explained that this was the first real estate investment he'd ever made, a small rental property he'd purchased in 1987 with money saved from overtime shifts at the factory. This was the beginning, he'd written. I bought this house not because I wanted to be a landlord, but because I wanted to understand how money could work for me instead of me always working for money. Everything that came after started with this decision to think differently about what was possible. The photograph was a reminder that Grandpa Bob's wealth hadn't come from luck or special knowledge, but from a willingness to educate himself and take calculated risks over time. He'd started with the same financial resources that were available to any working person, but he'd made different choices about spending and saving, choosing long-term growth over immediate gratification. As I prepared to leave Chicago and return to Cedar Falls, Catherine walked me to the elevator and offered some final thoughts. "Your grandfather talked about you often during our meetings," she said. "He was incredibly proud of your dedication to teaching and your commitment to helping children learn and grow. He saw those qualities as evidence that you would use this inheritance to create opportunities for others, rather than just improving your own circumstance." The drive back to Cedar Falls passed in a blur of highway signs and farmland, but my mind was focused on the conversation I'd just had, and the responsibility I'd just accepted. The documents in my briefcase represented legal control over assets worth more than $100 million, but they also represented Grandpa Bob's faith in my character and his confidence in my judgment. That evening, I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to process everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago I'd been a struggling elementary school teacher living paycheck to paycheck. Now I was technically one of the wealthiest people in Iowa, with the power to change lives and communities in ways I'd never imagined possible. But the most profound change wasn't financial, it was emotional. Understanding Grandpa Bob's true story had given me a different perspective on what wealth could be and what it should accomplish. He'd shown me that money was most powerful when it was used quietly and strategically, when it created opportunities rather than just purchased luxury. I thought about my students at Lincoln Elementary and the challenges they faced every day. I thought about Tyler, who needed after-school programs that his parents couldn't afford. I thought about Emma, who would benefit from reading specialists and tutoring that the school district couldn't provide. I thought about Maria, who deserved bilingual education programs that recognized her cultural background as an asset rather than an obstacle. For the first time since learning about the inheritance, I began to see concrete ways that this money could make a difference in the lives of people I cared about. But I also understood that effective philanthropy required the same patience and discipline that had built the fortune in the first place. Grandpa Bob's success had come from thinking in terms of decades rather than months, and any meaningful change I wanted to create would require the same long-term perspective. The next few weeks passed quietly as I adjusted to carrying this enormous secret while maintaining my normal routine. I continued teaching my third graders, grading their math homework and reading their creative writing assignments while knowing that I had the resources to transform their entire educational experience. The contrast between my public life and my private reality was surreal, but it also gave me time to observe and think about where the greatest needs existed. During lunch breaks, I found myself walking through the school and noticing details I'd previously taken for granted. The outdated textbooks, the broken playground equipment, the lack of art and music programs due to budget constraints, the dedicated teachers who spent their own money on classroom supplies because the district couldn't provide adequate funding, the bright, curious students who deserved every possible advantage but were limited by resources rather than potential. I also began to notice needs in the broader Cedar Falls community, the food bank that operated out of a church basement and struggled to meet increasing demand, the community center that wanted to offer job training programs but lacked the computers and facilities to make them effective, the public library that had eliminated weekend hours and reduced its book acquisition budget to nearly zero. These observations weren't academic anymore, they were opportunities. For the first time in my life, I had the power to address problems I'd always seen but never been able to solve. The inheritance represented not just financial security but the ability to create lasting positive change in my community and beyond. As November turned into December, I found myself thinking more and more about Grandpa Bob's final instructions to use the money wisely and in ways that honored shared value. He'd trusted me to carry forward his legacy, but he'd also given me the freedom to define what that legacy would look like in practice. The silver dollar he'd left me sat on my nightstand, catching the morning light each day as I prepared for work. It had become a symbol of the journey from small beginnings to significant impact, a reminder that the most important transformations often start with simple decisions to think differently about what's possible. Standing at my classroom window one snowy December morning, watching my students play during recess, I realized that I was ready to begin the next phase of this unexpected journey. Grandpa Bob had spent 35 years building the financial resources. Now it was time for me to spend the next 35 years putting those resources to work in ways that would honor his memory and create opportunities for generations to come. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes Iowa winters memorable for all the wrong reasons. I woke up in my small duplex to the sound of wind rattling the windows and the familiar drip of the kitchen faucet that my landlord still hadn't fixed. But for the first time in months, the sound didn't bother me. Instead, it reminded me of how far I'd come from the person who'd sat in that conference room 6 weeks ago, devastated by what seemed like the ultimate family rejection. I made coffee in Grandpa Bob's chipped blue mug, and sat at my kitchen table with the documents from Midwest Wealth Management spread out in front of me. Over the past month, I'd been developing a comprehensive plan for what Catherine Reynolds had diplomatically called strategic philanthropy, though I preferred to think of it as simply doing what needed to be done with the resources I'd been given. The first phase of my plan was already in motion. Working with Catherine and her team, I'd established the Robert Mitchell Educational Foundation, named for my grandfather, and focused on addressing the educational inequities I witnessed every day in my own classroom. The foundation would start small and local before expanding to regional and potentially national initiatives, following the same patient, methodical approach that had built the original fortune. The foundation's initial funding was $5 million, a sum that seemed astronomical to me but represented less than 5% of the total inheritance. Catherine had explained that this conservative approach would allow the foundation to establish credibility and operational excellence before taking on larger projects. It was exactly the kind of long-term thinking that Grandpa Bob would have appreciated. My phone rang while I was reviewing the Foundation's articles of incorporation, interrupting my thoughts about educational programming and grant distribution. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which meant this was probably the obligatory Christmas morning check-in that had become our family tradition since I'd moved out on my own. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness that she'd perfected for family occasions. "How are you spending the day? Are you coming over for dinner later?" I'd been dreading this conversation because it represented the first major test of my ability to maintain the secret of my inheritance. My family still believed that I'd received only a silver dollar and an old journal from Grandpa Bob's will, and they expected me to spend Christmas Day the same way I'd spent every Christmas for the past 5 years, helping with meal preparation and listening to Marcus talk about his latest real estate successes. "I'll be there around 2, I said, though the prospect of sitting through another family gathering where I pretended to be the struggling teacher while Marcus basked in his inheritance felt increasingly surreal. "Do you need me to bring anything?" "Just yourself, honey," my mother replied. "Marcus is so excited to show everyone the renovations he's planning for Grandpa's house. He's got such wonderful ideas for updating the kitchen and bathrooms. It's going to be beautiful when he's finished." The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus was planning to spend tens of thousands of dollars renovating a house that was worth less than what the foundation earned in interest every month. But I also understood that his excitement was genuine, and that the inheritance had given him something he'd never had before: real financial security and the confidence that came with it. After hanging up with my mother, I spent the morning putting the finishing touches on a document that would change everything for Lincoln Elementary School, though nobody there knew it yet. Working with the Foundation's legal team, I'd structured a comprehensive grant program that would provide funding for technology upgrades, reading specialists, after-school programs, and enhanced arts education. The total commitment was $2 million over 5 years, enough to transform the educational experience for every child in the school. The beauty of the grant structure was its sustainability. Rather than simply writing a large check, the foundation would provide funding that required matching contributions from the school district and documented improvements in student outcome. This approach ensured that the money would be used effectively and that the programs would continue even after the foundation's funding ended. I'd also been working on a much larger initiative that would extend far beyond Cedar Falls. The Midwest Rural Education Initiative would provide grants to small-town schools across Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, focusing on districts that served farming communities and faced the same budget constraints that limited opportunities for students in places like Cedar Falls. The program would start with 50 schools and grow to serve over 200 districts within 10 years. The research I'd done on rural education had been both inspiring and heartbreaking. I'd discovered schools where dedicated teachers were working miracles with outdated textbooks and obsolete technology, where students with enormous potential were limited by circumstances rather than ability. These schools needed exactly the kind of patient, long-term investment that the foundation could provide. At 1:30, I drove across town to my parents' house, carrying a small gift bag and the enormous weight of secrets I couldn't share. The house was warm and filled with the familiar smells of Christmas dinner, creating the kind of comfortable atmosphere that made family gatherings both comforting and complicated. Marcus was already there with his girlfriend Jennifer, a real estate agent from the next county who seemed impressed by his recent inheritance and his plans for spending it. They were sitting at the kitchen table with my father, looking at blueprints and renovation plans that Marcus had commissioned from a contractor in Des Moines. "Sarah," Marcus called out when he saw me, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. "Come look at these plans. We're going to completely modernize Grandpa's kitchen and add a master bathroom upstairs. Jennifer thinks we could increase the property value by at least 40%. I studied the blueprints politely, noting that the renovations would eliminate many of the features that had made Grandpa Bob's house feel like home. The cozy breakfast nook where we'd eaten countless Sunday lunches would become part of an open-concept kitchen. The small study where he'd managed his secret investments would be converted into a walk-in closet for the expanded master bedroom. "It looks very modern," I said, which was true even if it wasn't exactly a compliment. "Grandpa Bob would want you to make the house work for your family." This was also true, though I suspected Grandpa Bob would have been amused by the idea that anyone needed granite countertops and a jacuzzi tub to be happy. But I also understood that Marcus's renovations represented something deeper than materialism. For the first time in his life, he had the security to make long-term plans and invest in something permanent rather than living from commission to commission. My mother served dinner with the kind of careful attention to family dynamics that she'd perfected over decades of managing holiday gatherings. She made sure everyone had their favorite dishes, steered conversations away from potentially controversial topics, and created the illusion of family harmony even when underlying tensions were obvious to anyone paying attention. During the meal, Aunt Carol asked me about my teaching and whether I'd considered looking for a better paying job now that I was getting older and needed to think about retirement saving. The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the assumption that everyone still made about my financial situation. They saw me as the family member who needed to be worried about, the one who'd made impractical choices and would probably struggle financially for the rest of her life. "I love teaching," I said, which was completely true. I can't imagine doing anything else. This was also true, though my reasons for staying in the classroom had evolved considerably since learning about my inheritance. The teaching position gave me credibility and insight that I couldn't get any other way. It kept me connected to the real challenges facing students and educators, and it provided a perspective that would be invaluable as the foundation developed new programs. Most importantly, it allowed me to maintain the relationships and community connections that made my philanthropic work meaningful rather than abstract. After dinner, while my mother and Aunt Carol cleaned up and my father and Marcus watched football, I found myself standing in Grandpa Bob's former bedroom, now empty except for the small desk where he'd managed his investment. Jennifer was measuring the space for the walk-in closet, talking enthusiastically about organizational systems and built-in shoe racks. I thought about all the evenings Grandpa Bob had spent at that desk, reading financial reports and making the careful decisions that had built generational wealth. He'd sat in this modest room, surrounded by the same simple furniture and worn carpet, planning strategies that would eventually touch thousands of lives through the foundation that now bore his name. The contrast between his quiet discipline and the renovation plans being discussed downstairs was striking, but I realized it wasn't necessarily a criticism of Marcus or his choices. Grandpa Bob had built his fortune so it could be used, whether for granite countertops or educational grants. The money itself wasn't sacred. What mattered was that it served human purposes and created opportunities for people to build meaningful lives. On the drive home, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Catherine Reynolds the previous week, about the psychological challenges of sudden wealth. She'd explained that many inheritance recipients struggled with guilt about their good fortune, especially when they were surrounded by family and friends who had financial concerns. The key, she'd said, was finding ways to use the wealth that honored both the giver's intentions and the recipient's own values. This insight had helped me understand why Grandpa Bob had structured the inheritance the way he had. By keeping the bulk of his wealth secret, he'd protected me from the immediate pressure to solve everyone's financial problems, while also giving me time to develop a thoughtful approach to philanthropy. If my family had known about the $100 million, Christmas dinner would have been very different, and not necessarily in a good way. The week between Christmas and New Year's Eve was traditionally a quiet time in Cedar Falls, with most businesses closed and people focused on family time and recovery from holiday celebrations. But for me, it was a period of intense preparation for the changes that would begin with the new year. The Robert Mitchell Educational Foundation had received its official nonprofit designation from the IRS, and Catherine's team had completed all the legal and financial structures necessary to begin operation. The foundation would have its own office space in a renovated building downtown, though I would continue teaching and managing my philanthropic work during evenings and weekends. I'd also been working with a consultant who specialized in educational programming to develop the specific initiatives the foundation would support. The grant programs were designed to be more than just funding sources. They would provide technical assistance, professional development, and ongoing evaluation to ensure that the money created lasting improvements rather than temporary fixes. The most ambitious project was the Rural Teacher Fellowship Program, which would provide scholarships for education students who committed to teaching in small-town schools for at least 5 years after graduation. The program would address the teacher shortage that plagued rural districts while also ensuring that students in places like Cedar Falls had access to well-trained, dedicated educators. On New Year's Eve, I received a call from Catherine with news that brought tears to my eyes. The investment portfolio had performed exceptionally well during the fourth quarter, generating returns that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The foundation's endowment had grown to over $6 million before we'd even announced our first grants, providing a level of financial security that would allow us to expand our programming faster than originally planned. "Your grandfather would be very proud," Catherine said, her voice warm with genuine emotion. "He always believed that patient investing combined with strategic giving could create exponential positive impact. You're proving him right." That night, as Cedar Falls celebrated the new year with fireworks over the community center and families gathering in downtown for the annual countdown, I sat in my small kitchen writing thank you letters to the people who'd helped make the foundation possible. I wrote to Harrison for his discretion and guidance, to Catherine for her expertise and patience, and to the consultant who'd helped design our educational programs. But the most important letter was one I wrote to Grandpa Bob himself, even though I knew he'd never read it. I told him about the foundation and the programs we'd developed, about my decision to continue teaching while managing philanthropic work, and about my commitment to honoring his memory through patient, strategic giving that would create opportunities for generations to come. In that letter, I also thanked him for the deception that had seemed so hurtful at first. By giving me time to process the inheritance privately, he'd allowed me to develop a thoughtful approach to wealth that was based on my own values rather than external expectations. The silver dollar and journal had been perfect symbols of his belief in starting small and building something meaningful over time. January brought the first real test of my ability to manage my dual identity as struggling teacher and secret philanthropist. The Robert Mitchell Educational Foundation announced its first round of grants, starting with the comprehensive program for Lincoln Elementary that would transform the school where I taught. The announcement created tremendous excitement in Cedar Falls, particularly among educators who'd been struggling with inadequate resources for years. Principal Martinez called an all-staff meeting to discuss the grant and plan the implementation of new programs, and I found myself in the surreal position of sitting in that meeting while knowing that I was the anonymous donor who'd made it all possible. "This is the most significant gift our school has ever received," Principal Martinez announced to the assembled teachers. "The foundation has asked for complete anonymity, but they've clearly done their research about our needs and challenges. This funding will allow us to achieve goals we've been dreaming about for years." Watching my colleagues' faces as they learned about the reading specialists, technology upgrades, and after-school programs was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. These were dedicated professionals who'd been making miracles happen with limited resources, and they deserved every tool and support system the foundation could provide. Ms. Thompson, who taught second grade and had been at Lincoln for over 20 years, actually started crying when she learned about the library expansion and new book acquisition budget. "I've been using the same reading series for 15 years, she said. My students deserve so much better than what we've been able to give them." The foundation's grants extended far beyond Lincoln Elementary. Over the first 6 months of operation, we funded programs in 12 different schools across central Iowa, always working through intermediary organizations to maintain anonymity. Each grant was carefully structured to ensure sustainability and measurable outcomes, following the disciplined approach that had built the original fortune. The Rural Teacher Fellowship Program launched with its first cohort of 20 students, all of whom had committed to teaching in small-town schools after graduation. The program provided full tuition coverage, living expenses, and additional professional development opportunities that would prepare them for the unique challenges of rural education. By summer, the foundation's impact was becoming visible throughout the region. Test scores were improving in schools that had received grants, teacher retention was increasing in districts that participated in our fellowship program, and communities were beginning to see education as a source of hope, rather than a persistent challenge. The success brought attention from state education officials and national philanthropic organizations, but the foundation maintained its policy of anonymity for the primary donor. In interviews and presentations, I was identified only as the foundation's executive director, with references to a local family that had established the endowment to honor the memory of a loved one. This carefully maintained fiction allowed me to continue teaching at Lincoln Elementary while managing the foundation's growing operation. My colleagues knew that I'd taken on additional responsibilities with a local nonprofit, but they assumed it was typical teacher volunteerism rather than management of a multi-million-dollar philanthropic enterprise. The dual identity was challenging but deeply rewarding. Teaching kept me grounded in the daily realities of education, while foundation work allowed me to address systemic issues that individual teachers couldn't solve alone. I was able to see both the immediate impact of specific programs and the long-term potential for transformational change. One evening in late summer, as I was reviewing applications for the foundation's second round of grants, I realized that we'd achieved something Grandpa Bob would have deeply appreciated. The foundation was operating with the same patient, strategic approach that had built his investment portfolio, focusing on sustainable impact rather than dramatic gesture. More importantly, the foundation was creating the kind of opportunities that Grandpa Bob had valued most: chances for people to develop their potential and build meaningful lives through their own effort. The grants provided tools and resources, but the real work was being done by dedicated teachers, motivated students, and supportive communities that were committed to educational excellence. Standing in my classroom that fall, watching a new group of third graders work with technology and books that the foundation had provided, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from using resources wisely and seeing tangible results from strategic investment. Tyler's younger brother was in my new class, and he had access to reading specialists and after-school programs that Tyler had never enjoyed. Emma's cousin was benefiting from the enhanced arts programming that brought creativity and joy back into the curriculum. The silver dollar still sat on my nightstand, catching the morning light as I prepared for each day of teaching and foundation work. It reminded me daily that the most significant transformations often begin with modest steps and patient persistence, that wealth is most powerful when it's used to create opportunities rather than purchase luxury. Grandpa Bob had spent 35 years building a fortune through discipline and delayed gratification. I was now spending my years putting that fortune to work in ways that honored his memory and created lasting positive change. The inheritance hadn't changed who I was, It had simply given me the tools to become more fully the person I'd always been called to be. On the second anniversary of Grandpa Bob's death, I visited his grave at Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery, bringing flowers and a brief report on the foundation's accomplishment. The Robert Mitchell Educational Foundation was now supporting 43 schools across 3 states, had graduated its first class of rural teacher fellows, and was beginning to develop programs for early childhood education and adult literacy. Standing at his gravestone, reading the simple inscription that identified him as a devoted father and grandfather, I thought about the secret life he'd lived and the legacy he'd created. Few people would ever know that Robert Mitchell had been one of the most successful investors in Iowa history, but thousands of students would benefit from his patience and wisdom for generations to come. Marcus drove up as I was placing the flowers. Having developed his own tradition of visiting the grave on the anniversary, he looked prosperous and content, with the kind of confidence that comes from financial security and successful business ventures. The inheritance had allowed him to expand his real estate practice and invest in commercial properties, creating the stability he'd always sought. "How's the teaching going?" he asked, genuinely interested in my work even though he'd never fully understood my career. "And that foundation you're working with, Mom says you're helping schools get grants. It's rewarding work," I said, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. I think Grandpa Bob would approve of the focus on education and helping people build better lives. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, looking at the gravestone with an expression of genuine affection. "He was always so proud of you," he said. "I think he knew you'd find a way to make a difference, even with limited resources." The irony of that statement was profound, but it also revealed something important about how wealth should function. The foundation's impact wasn't about having unlimited resources, it was about using those resources wisely and strategically to create opportunities that people could build upon with their own efforts and dedication. As Marcus drove away and I prepared to leave the cemetery, I realized that Grandpa Bob's greatest gift hadn't been the money itself, but the example he'd set of how to live with purpose and create lasting value. He'd shown me that true wealth comes from patient discipline, strategic thinking, and the willingness to invest in other people's potential rather than your own immediate gratification. The sun was setting over Cedar Falls as I drove home, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reminded me of Iowa's endless possibility. In my small duplex, the kitchen faucet was still dripping and the furniture was still a collection of mismatched pieces, but none of that mattered anymore. I had everything I needed to continue the work that Grandpa Bob had started, building something beautiful and lasting that would honor his memory and create opportunities for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.